Delilah Mercer stepped off the noon coach in Harland, Montana, with one duffel bag, $43 sewn into her hem, and a marriage letter she had read so many times the fold had gone soft as cloth. She was 34. The men on the depot bench looked her up and down, took in the white of her, and one of them laughed into his coffee. The plank platform smelled of coal smoke and horse and the first cold breath of a Montana autumn. Her boots were split at the toe. The mountains stood bone-pale behind the town, already dusted white. The rancher who had sent for her took one look and did not get down from his wagon. "You'll want the next coach back," Silas Crane said. "I've 6 boys and no money and no use for a woman who can't hold up." She did not answer. She only tightened her grip on the ladle handle poking from her bag and breathed and settled her feet on the frozen boards. For a long moment neither of them moved. The horses stamped. A dog crossed the empty street. Somewhere a shutter banged loose in the wind that came down off the pass, and Delilah felt it go through the worn wool of her coat like it meant to find out what she was made of. She had crossed 4 states to stand on these boards. She had sold her mother's ring in Sioux Falls to buy the last 2 legs of the journey. There was no coach back that she could afford, and both of them knew a woman did not sew her whole savings into her hem unless the hem was all she had left. "I can hold up," she said. Her voice came quiet and even. "You've not seen me try." Silas Crane worked his jaw. He was a big man gone hard, a widower 2 winters into his grief, with a black beard shot through with gray and eyes that had forgotten how to expect anything but more of the same. He had written the letter in a bad week and regretted it in every week since. He had pictured, if he had pictured anything, a slim thing who would keep house and mind her tongue. He had not pictured this. And the cruelty in him, the tired cruelty that debt breeds in a proud man, wanted to say so plainly, but the boards were freezing and the light was going and there was nothing behind him at the ranch but 6 hungry boys and a cold stove. So he jerked his chin at the wagon bed. "Get in, then. Don't say I didn't warn you off." She lifted her duffel and climbed up without help, which she noticed he did not offer. And she settled her weight and folded her raw hands in her lap and looked straight ahead at the road out of Harland while the town watched her go. The mercantile man stood in his doorway. 2 women by the water trough leaned their heads together. The one who had laughed on the bench called out something she chose not to hear, and the wind took it, and she was glad. She had learned a long time ago how to make herself deaf. It was a thing a woman built like her learned early. The way a left-handed child learns to write with the right, you did not fight the world's meanness head-on. You simply stopped giving it a place to land. Her mother had never learned it and had been bitter to the grave. Her grandmother had learned it so well that laughter slid off her like rain off oilcloth, and men who came to sneer at the granny woman in the hills stayed to be doctored and left grateful. Delilah had chosen her grandmother's way. She sat in the jolting wagon with her chin level and her eyes on the mountains, and she let Harland say what it liked. The truth she carried, the truth she had told no one, was that she had not come to Montana for a marriage. She had come for a place to be useful before she died. She had buried a good young husband and a stillborn daughter in the same Ohio winter 11 years back, and after that she had cooked in other women's kitchens and doctored other women's children and grown year on year into a woman nobody looked at twice except to remark on her size. And one gray morning she had read Silas Crane's advertisement in a paper a boarder left behind. A widower with 6 motherless sons wanting a wife who could cook and keep a house and was not afraid of hard country, and something in her that had been sleeping for 11 years had opened one eye. 6 motherless boys. A cold house. That was not a burden to Delilah Mercer. That was a calling with an address. The road to the Crane Ranch ran 9 miles up into the foothills, past fences with the wire sagging and gates that hung on one hinge and a creek already skimmed with the first ice. Delilah watched the land the way a person reads a face. She saw the good bones of it under the neglect. She saw grass that would fatten cattle if a body had cattle to spare, and a stand of timber that meant winter fuel. And a sky so wide it made a person small and, strangely, made the smallness bearable. She did not speak. Silas did not speak. The wagon jolted and the mountains turned from bone to blue to the deep bruise color of dusk, and she breathed the cold, clean air and let it steady her. The ranch house, when it came, was a low log affair with a plank lean-to kitchen tacked on the back. A barn gone silver with weather, and one thin thread of smoke leaning off the chimney into the dark. A lamp burned in a single window. As the wagon rolled into the yard, that lamp moved, and then the door opened, and 6 shapes came out onto the porch and stood in a stiff, wary row, watching the wagon the way barn cats watch a stranger. 6 boys. She had known the number from the letter, and still the sight of them lined up in the failing light closed something in her throat. The tallest stood near 6 foot, all elbows and suspicion, maybe 17. Then a stair-step of them down and down, a pair close in age who could only be near twins, a slighter one who hung back, a boy of 10 with a bandaged gray on one hand, and at the end of the row, half hid behind the tall one's leg, the littlest. 7, perhaps, barefoot on the cold boards, holding a carved wooden horse against his chest like it could keep him warm. Boys, Silas said, and that was all the introduction he made. This is her. Not one of them said a word. The tall one, whose name she would learn, was Amos. Looked at her wide middle and her split boots and her plain face, and made a sound in his throat that his father did not check. The near twins, Eli and Isaac, exchanged a glance she was meant to see. The slight one, Ben, looked at his feet. The 10-year-old with the bandaged hand, Caleb, glared. And the littlest one, the barefoot one, Toby, stared at her with a naked, painful hope he was too young to hide, and then, catching his brothers' faces, hid it anyway and looked at the boards. Delilah climbed down from the wagon on her own. She stood in the mud of the yard in the last of the light, and she looked at each of them in turn, slow, unhurried, the way you'd let a nervous horse smell your hand. Then she looked past them through the open door at the dark, cold kitchen behind, and she saw what she had crossed 4 states to find. She saw a stove gone out. She saw a table with nothing on it. She saw a house where nobody had cooked a real supper in a long, long time. Well, she said quietly, to no one and to all of them, let's see about getting you fed. She walked up the porch steps past the row of them, and none of them followed, and she went into the cold kitchen alone and set down her duffel and rolled her sleeves to the elbow. The stove was a cast-iron range, good iron gone black and greasy from neglect, the firebox choked with cold ash. On the back of it, shoved to the wall, sat a cookpot, a big cast-iron kettle, 3-legged. The kind a body could feed an army from, and it too had been let go, a crust of some long-ago meal dried hard in the bottom of it. She lifted the lid. The smell that came up was old and sour. Somebody's mother had cooked in this pot once, and cooked well. She could tell by the seasoning under the neglect, the way you can tell a good knife under rust. Then somebody's mother had died, and the pot had gone cold, and the boys had gone hungry, and the whole house had held its breath for 2 winters, waiting to see who would leave next. Delilah Mercer set the lid down soft. She found the ash bucket. She knelt at the firebox in her traveling dress, with the mud still on her hem, and she cleaned it out, handful by handful, and laid the fire the way her grandmother had taught her, a nest of shavings, a teepee of kindling, the split wood after, and she struck the match, and the flame caught and steadied and grew. And for the first time in 2 winters, the Crane kitchen began, slowly, to warm. She had no larder to speak of, a quarter sack of flour weeviled at the bottom, a rind of salt pork, a crock of milk half turned, some withered potatoes in the cellar, an onion, a handful of dried beans, a little cornmeal, and this she found on a high shelf, forgotten, a twist of dried sage and thyme in brown paper, a dead woman's garden put up and never used. It was not much. It was, to a woman who knew what she was doing, enough she had cooked from less. She had cooked a Christmas supper for 9 once, in a lean year in Ohio, out of a hen past laying, and a sack of cornmeal, and a jar of somebody's pickled beans, and the men had gone away, swearing it was the best meal of their lives, which it had not been, but a hungry man's memory is a kind memory. The trick was never the ingredients. The trick was patience and salt, and knowing that the difference between slop and supper was mostly time and attention. 2 things nobody in this cold house had spent on a meal in a long while. Delilah moved through the strange dark kitchen, learning it with her hands where the good knife hung, how the oven drew, which board in the floor creaked so she'd know the tread of anyone coming, the way she'd learned a dozen kitchens before it, and by the time the fire had the range warm, she had the shape of the place and the shape of the meal both. She scrubbed the cook pot with sand and lye and hot water until the iron came clean and dark and true. She rendered the salt pork slow. She built a broth from the bones and the drippings and the last of the milk, and she cut the potatoes and the onion in, and the beans she'd been soaking since the last relay station in her 1-tin cup, and she rubbed the pork with the dead woman's sage, and she made from almost nothing a thick, plain, honest stew, and she baked a pan of corn bread in the oven off the same fire. And the smell of it filled the cold house and went out under the door and out into the yard where 6 boys stood in the dark, not knowing what to do with the thing that was happening. It was full dark when she set the pot in the middle of the plank table with the wooden ladle standing up in it, and lit the 2 lamps and stood back. Silas came in from the barn. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She watched his face and saw it do a thing he did not want it to do, saw 2 winters of grief and cold suppers crack for just a moment at the smell of his dead wife's sage, and then she watched him shut it away hard. "Boys," she called. Quiet. Out the door, into the dark. Supper, they came in one at a time, weary, hungry, filthy, Amos last and stiffest, Toby first, and can't help it fast. The wooden horse still clutched in his hand. They sat where they'd always sat. There was an empty chair at the foot of the table, worn smooth, that nobody sat in and nobody looked at, and Delilah understood, without being told, whose chair it had been, and she did not sit in it. She stood at the stove and ladled out bowl after bowl and passed them down the table. And the boys looked at the food and looked at their father, and Silas, jaw tight, picked up his spoon. The room went quiet in the good way, the way a room goes quiet when hungry people are finally eating. Delilah watched Toby empty his bowl and hold it up, not quite daring to ask, and she filled it again, and he whispered thank you, ma'am, so low she nearly missed it. And Caleb kicked him under the table, and Toby's face closed, and Delilah pretended she had seen none of it. She ate last and least, standing, and she did not say a word about how they ate, and when the pot was empty she scraped the ladle clean and hung it on its nail by the stove where a ladle belongs. That first night she slept on a pallet by the warm stove, because there was no other place. And she did not mind. She lay in the firelight and listened to the house, 6 boys breathing in the loft, the big man's heavier breath through the wall, the wind working at the eaves, and she held the truth of where she was quiet in her chest and did not let it frighten her. She had married a stranger who did not want her, to raise 6 sons who did not want her, on a ranch that was drowning. She had done harder things. She had buried a husband and a baby, both in one bad Ohio winter, and got up the next morning and kept living, and no one had laughed at her for that, though it had been harder than any laughing. She breathed and settled and slept. Up in the loft that first night, the boys held a whispered council in the dark, the way boys do. Amos said she would be gone inside a month, like the 2 hired women their father had tried before her, the ones who had taken one look at 6 wild motherless boys and a hard grieving man and a mountain of work and fled back to town on the next wagon. Eli agreed because Eli agreed with Amos. Caleb said nothing, holding his bad hand against his chest in the dark where the cut had begun to fester and the throb of it kept him from sleep, and he did not tell his brothers about the hand because there was already enough wrong. And little Toby, half asleep, said into the dark that she smelled like biscuits, and Amos told him to shut up, and Toby did. But he lay there a while, turning the wooden horse in his fingers and thinking about the second bowl she'd filled without being asked, and the way she'd said his name soft when she called them in. And he decided, in the private courtroom of a 7-year-old's heart, that he would like her to stay even if his brothers wouldn't. He kept that verdict secret. It felt dangerous to want a thing that much. Below them, through the plank wall, Silas Grain lay awake too. He could smell the sage in the walls of the house now, his dead wife Mary's sage, and it undid him in a way he would not have admitted to a living soul. For 2 winters the house had smelled of cold ash and unwashed boys and grief. Now it smelled like a meal Mary might have made, and the wrongness and rightness of that fought in him half the night. He had told the woman to take the coach back, and he had meant it, standing on that depot platform, looking at a stranger he could not afford and did not want. But she had walked into his cold, dead house and lit his cold, dead stove and fed his boys the first real supper they'd had since the funeral. And she'd done it without being asked and without complaint and without one word about the mess or the poverty or the 6 pairs of hostile eyes, and Silas Grain, lying awake, could not make that fact fit the shape of the woman he had decided to send away. He resolved to send her back all the same come spring when the passes opened. He told himself that firmly. Then he breathed in the sage and did not sleep. Morning came gray and cold. She was up before any of them, the fire built back up, the pot on for porridge, when Silas came through pulling on his coat and stopped short at the sight of her already working. "You don't have to earn your keep the first day," he said, and it came out rougher than he meant, the way everything came out of him now. "I'm not earning anything," she said, not looking up from the pot. "I'm cooking breakfast. There's a difference. Sit down and eat before you go out to it." He looked at her a moment. Then he sat and ate, and the boys straggled down and ate. And it was the second warm meal in that kitchen in 2 winters, and the strangeness of that sat on all of them, and none of them named it. So it began. The days took a shape. Delilah rose first and cooked, and while the porridge went, she swept 2 winters of grief out the door, literally the dirt and the ash and the mouse mess and the cobwebs and something less literal along with it. She scrubbed the plank floor to pale wood. She boiled the boys' clothes and mended the rents, and there were a great many rents. She found the dead woman's mending basket and her button jar and her recipe hand, 3 pages in a fading pencil script, tucked in the flour bin against the damp, and Delilah read those pages by lamplight like scripture and cooked from them. And if a boy noticed his mother's exact way with a bean or a biscuit and looked up sharp, she let him look and said nothing. The boys did not thaw all at once. That is not how boys thaw. Toby came first because he was littlest and his want was biggest, and within a week he was underfoot in the kitchen, handing her things, learning the names of the herbs, and she let him stir the pot with the great wooden ladle held in both his small hands, and she told him he had a cook's arm, and he glowed for an hour. Ben came next, the slight one, drawn by warmth the way a cold thing is, sitting in the corner, whittling and pretending not to listen while she hummed. Caleb, the 10-year-old, stayed angry, longest of the middle ones. His bandaged hand a story she hadn't been told, and the near twins, Eli and Isaac, followed whoever was winning and kept their own counsel. She learned them the way she'd learned the kitchen, with patience and without ever letting them see she was studying them. She learned that Ben, the slight one, had a stammer that came out when he was rushed and vanished when he was calm, and so she never rushed him, and within 2 weeks he was talking to her in whole, smooth sentences he didn't seem to notice he was managing. She learned that Eli and Isaac, the near twins, had a private language of glances and elbows and could work as one animal when they chose, and that the fastest way to their good side was to feed them enormous quantities of anything and never once remark on the size of a growing boy's appetite. She learned that Amos carried the whole family on his young back, did a man's work in the barn before light, kept the accounts he could barely read, stood between his father's grief and his brother's hunger, and that he was so tired underneath his hardness that it broke her heart to look at him. And so she was careful never to let him catch her looking. And she learned, without being told, that somewhere in the house there was a story about Caleb's hand that the boys were keeping from their father, because she'd watched Caleb hide the hand under the table at supper and watched the other boys not look at it in the particular way that means a secret is being kept. She did not force it. She only started leaving a basin of warm water and clean cloth on the washstand each night, and a small crock of the salve she'd rendered from bear grease and yarrow, and she said to the room in general and to no one that a body could help itself to it who had need. And on the 4th night she woke on her pallet in the low firelight and saw Caleb crept down from the loft in his nightshirt, soaking his bad hand in the basin in the dark, his face screwed up against the pane of it. Too proud to ask, and she lay still and pretended sleep and let the boy doctor himself, and only in the morning did she say, easy, buttering his bread, that if the hand wasn't better by Sunday, she'd have a look whether he liked it or not. And Caleb glared at her, and she buttered his bread, and something was settled between them. Amos, the eldest, did not thaw at all. Amos, at 17, remembered his mother best and grieved her hardest, and had appointed himself the keeper of that grief, and to Amos this wide, plain stranger cooking his mother's food from his mother's book in his mother's kitchen was not comfort. It was theft. He ate what she made because a body must eat. He said thank you to no one. And one gray afternoon in the second week, Delilah found the recipe pages gone from the flour bin, and she found them that evening in the cold ashes of the yard fire pit. 3 pages of a dead woman's hand curled and blackened, and she knelt in the cold and lifted them out, and they crumbled in her raw fingers, and she understood. And she did not cry where anyone could see, and she did not say a word to Silas. But that night at supper she set down the pot and stood at the head of the table by the stove, and she looked down the length of it at Amos, who would not look up, and she said, quiet and steady, I know whose kitchen this was. I know whose book that was. I've not come to take her place, nobody could, and I'd not want to. I came to feed you. That's all. You can hate me the whole time you eat, and I'll still fill your bowl. She paused. But you'll not burn what's left of her again. Not while I'm cooking on her stove. She's in the seasoning of that pot, boy, and in the way you all like your beans. And you can't burn that out no matter how hot you build the fire. Amos looked up then. For 1 second his face was 17 and motherless and terrified, and then it was hard again. And he shoved back his chair and left his bowl and went up to the loft. But he did not touch the pot again. And the next morning, though he'd never admit it, he ate. If you've made it this far into Delilah's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Because the piece of that kitchen was a small warm thing, and outside it the ranch was still dying, and Delilah had been a married woman on the Crane place 3 weeks when she learned exactly how close to the edge they truly stood. It was the herbs that did it. She'd been drying wild things she found along the creek and the fence lines, yarrow. The dead woman's sage gone feral in the kitchen patch, a bitter root her grandmother had called fever root that grew in the shade of the timber, and building a little store of them on the high shelf, the way she'd been raised to. Her grandmother had walked her out into the Ohio hills 100 mornings before Delilah was 10, naming each plant and its virtue, teaching her which leaf drew a fever down, and which bark stopped a flux, and which flower, steeped, would let a body in pain finally sleep. It was a whole doctoring learned by the hand and the nose and the tongue, no book to it. Only the long, patient passing down of women who had kept a county alive before there was a road wide enough to bring a proper doctor in. Delilah had thought that learning would die with her, unused, a plain woman's forgotten dowry. She had not counted on Montana. She had not counted on a frontier that was, in the end, only another hill country full of people too far from help. And on a shelf of dried wild things that would, before that first winter was out, be worth more to Harland than all of Elias Thorne's gold. She doctored Caleb's hand, which had gone bad under its gray bandage, a deep cut off a broken hay knife that the boys had hidden from their father, because their father had enough to worry on. She'd soaked it in a wash she made and packed it in a poultice and drawn the poison out of it over 4 days, and the boy's fever had broken and his hand had healed clean, and Caleb, who had glared longest, had looked at her while she wound the last clean strip and said, gruff as his father, it doesn't hurt now, which was, from Caleb, a declaration of love. Word of that healed hand traveled the ranch quiet, the way things travel among boys. Caleb, who had glared longest, now followed her about the kitchen the way Toby did, gruff and grudging and never far, and he began to bring her things. A bird's nest, a good stone, once a clutch of late wild plums he'd found in a fence corner and carried home, careful in his hat. Small tithes of a boy's regard laid at the feet of the person who had made his hand stop hurting. And it was through Caleb that the family's deepest fear finally reached her, because Caleb had begun to trust her, and a boy who trusts you cannot hold a thing that heavy alone forever. He found her at the drying shelf and stood a while working up to it, and finally said, "Pa's going to lose the ranch." She kept her hand steady on the yarrow. "Tell me." And the boy told her, in the flat, too-old voice of a child who has carried a grown man's fear too long, the thing his father would not say. There was a note on the ranch, held by the bank in Harland and by the man who ran the bank, a smooth gray man named Elias Thorne, who wore a black frock coat and had wanted the crane grass and the crane water for years, and had been patient about it the way a spider is patient. Silas had borrowed against the herd 2 winters back to bury his wife and get his boys through. And the herd had come through the last winter thin, and the note was 4 months behind, and the whole of it, 180 acres, the water rights, the house their mother had died in, came due the first day of December. If the note wasn't cleared by then, Thorne took the ranch. And it was the middle of October, and there was no money, and the only thing standing between the Crane boys and a wagon out of Harland with nothing was a herd of cattle too thin to sell for half what was owed. Delilah set down the yarrow. She breathed. She looked out the window at the mountains and the early snow on them, and she did the arithmetic, quiet, in her head, the way she'd done arithmetic her whole life over ledgers other people thought she couldn't read. 4 months behind. December 1st. And she thought. 6 weeks. She had 6 weeks. She did not have an inheritance. She had no hidden vault, no dead relative's fortune, no lawyer coming with a paper to set it all right. She had $41 left of her 43, a cook pot, a shelf of herbs, 2 capable hands, and a stubbornness her mother had called a sin and her grandmother had called a spine. It would have to be enough. It had always had to be enough. That was the day Delilah Mercer stopped being a woman who had come to be fed and sheltered and started being a woman with a plan. She started with the thing she knew. Harland was a town of hard single men, cowhands off the big spreads, teamsters, the crews laying the new spur line east of town, men who ate at Ma Dooley's boarding house when they ate it all. And Ma Dooley had died in the spring, and her boarding house table had died with her, and the men of Harland had been eating cold beans out of cans and worse for half a year, and were meaner for it. Delilah had seen it on the depot bench her first hour in town, hungry men laughing to cover being hungry. She knew that hunger. She knew the cure for it. She took the wagon into Harland on a Saturday alone, and she was laughed at again. Word had gone round about the fat bride Silas Crane had sent for, and the men outside the mercantile made their remarks. And Thorne himself watched her from the bank window with a small, dry smile, and 2 of the church women turned their shoulders. Delilah bought what she'd come for with her own hoarded dollars, a sack of good flour, coffee, molasses, dried apples, and she loaded it herself, and on her way out she stopped by the crew of spur-line men eating their cold dinner in the shade of the depot, and she said, "Plain, any of you tired of eating out of a can?" They laughed. Of course they laughed. But one of them, an older man with a bad leg and no meanness in him, name of Gus, said, "Ma'am, I'd trade a day's wage for a plate of something hot that a person made." "You keep your wage," Delilah said. "First plate's free. If it's worth paying for after, we'll talk." I'll be at the old Dooley Place kitchen Thursday noon. Tell whoever's hungry." And she climbed up and drove out, and the men laughed after her, but Gus did not laugh. And Gus told the others. She had rented the cold Dooley kitchen off the widow's heir for near nothing, because it had sat empty and useless, and she scrubbed it out over 2 days the way she'd scrubbed the crane stove. And Thursday noon she had the cook pot going. She'd hauled it in the wagon, the crane pot, because it was the pot she trusted, and a great steaming kettle of beef and barley soup rich with marrow and the last of the season's carrots, and pans of biscuits and coffee that a man could stand a spoon in. She'd spent all her flour and near her last dollars on it. It was everything she had in a pot, and she stood behind it in her flour-dusted apron and waited to see if anyone would come. Gus came. And Gus had told the others, and 11 men came behind him, sheepish, ready to sneer. And they ate. And the sneer went off their faces with the first spoonful the way weather goes off a sky. And there was that good quiet again. The quiet of hungry men finally fed, and when the pot was empty, a teamster named Cobb wiped his bowl with the last biscuit and looked up at her and said, "Ma'am, I'll pay you 2 bits for that any day of the week you'll cook it." And he laid the coins on the plank counter, and one by one the others did the same. And Delilah Mercer stood behind her cook pot with her raw hands folded and did not let them see what it did to her. She'd not been sure they'd pay. She'd have fed them free and counted it well spent, because a town's opinion turns on its stomach. And she needed Harland's opinion turned before December more than she needed its quarters. But the quarters came, laid down, one after another on the plank counter, silver in the thin light through the Dooley kitchen's dusty window. And Delilah counted them that night at the ranch by the lamp, $2.75 from a single pot of soup, and she sat a long moment with the little stack of coins in front of her and did arithmetic. If 11 men on a Thursday made near $3, then 20 men 3 days a week made. And here her breath came a little short. Because a woman who has sewn her savings into her hem does not take $3 sums lightly, near $18 a week, if it held, if it grew, if the fever of curiosity that brought men to gawk at the fat bride's cooking turned into the habit of hungry men eating well. It was not enough to clear a $190 note by December. But it was not nothing, and nothing was what she'd had a month before. She banked the coins in a lard tin and hid the tin in the flour and blew out the lamp and lay down and did not sleep for the arithmetic running warm behind her eyes. Word of a thing like that travels a frontier town faster than fire. By the next Thursday there were 20 men. By the one after, she was cooking 3 days a week, and then 5, and the men paid their 2 bits, and some paid more, and some who had no coin split her a rick of firewood or brought her a haunch of venison or a sack of their mother's put-up preserves. And Delilah kept it all in a ledger in her steady hand and did the arithmetic every night by the lamp. She hired Gus, whose bad leg kept him off the range, to help her haul and wash. She was up before dawn on the Crane place, cooking for her own boys, then driving the 9 miles to town to cook for other people's, then driving home in the dark to cook a third time. And she did it on 4 hours sleep and a spine, and the ranch boys, watching her go and come, began, even Amos, to understand what was being done for them, and why, and by whom. The town's women were slower. Women always are about another woman, and Delilah did not hold it against them, having been a hard-judging young woman herself once before life sanded the corners off her. The wives of Harland had their own reasons for wariness. A cook shop full of single men was a scandal-shaped thing to a careful woman, and the fat stranger who ran it was a crane now, wed to the hardest widower in the county. And there was the old ugly arithmetic that a plain woman's kindness must be a play for something. So they watched her from across the street and behind their curtains and said their small things, and Delilah cooked and waited, because she had learned that you cannot argue a town's women into liking you. You can only be in front of them day on day exactly what you are until the being of it wears the suspicion smooth. The doctor's wife came first, because the doctor sent her, of which more in a moment. Then the widow Hetty Salt, who ran the mercantile and had turned her shoulder that first Saturday, came into the Dooley kitchen one Thursday and stood a while in the doorway with her mouth set and watched Delilah feed a table of teamsters, and watched the men say please and thank you to the fat bride like she was their own mother, and finally Hetty crossed the floor and admitted, stiff as a woman admitting a sin, that her flour was moving off the mercantile shelf faster than it had in a year on account of a certain new cook, and that fair was fair, and that she'd been raised to say so when a thing was so. Hetty Salt was a widow herself, hard as a hickory knot, no soft edges anywhere on her, and Delilah liked her on sight for exactly that. Delilah wiped her hand on her apron and put it out, and Hetty shook it one hard pump and said she'd hold Delilah's flour at the fall price through the winter as a matter of business, not friendship, and Delilah said she'd take it as business and be glad. And both women understood perfectly that it was friendship, and neither would ever call it that, and that was the beginning of the town turning. But it was the fever that turned it all the way. The first hard blizzard of the season came the third week of November, 3 days of white wind that shut the passes and buried the fences and killed a dozen head of cattle up in the timber. And when it broke, it left the cold behind it, a still deep cold that got into the lungs of a town already worn down. And with the cold came the fever, a bad grip that started on the spur line camp where men lived rough and close and spread down into Harland proper faster than the one old doctor could ride. Dr. Amos Whitcomb, the boy Amos, was named for a different Amos, but the doctor's name being the same was a small, strange comfort to the eldest Crane boy later. Dr. Whitcomb was near 70 and worn to the bone, and within a week he had 40 sick men and women and children across the town and the camp, and no way to be in 40 places, and people were dying. Old Gus took it. 2 of the spur line men Delilah had fed took it. And then it came up the 9 miles to the Crane Ranch, and it took Toby. It came on him fast, the way it takes the little ones. The barefoot boy with the wooden horse burned up in the loft in a single afternoon, and by dark he was raving, his small chest heaving, his fever so high that Silas, that hard man, stood over his youngest son's bed with his hands hanging useless at his sides, and the look of a man watching the last of his family slide away from him into the same dark that had taken their mother. This was the low point. This was the middle of the night in the middle of the story, the blizzard cold and the fever and the debt all closed in at once, December 1st, 8 days off, and no money, and now a dying child, and Silas Crane broke in a way Delilah had not yet seen him break. He turned to her in the firelight with his boy dying, and he said, hoarse, stripped of all his hardness, "Do something. Please. You're the only one. I don't know how to. Do something." And Delilah Mercer rolled up her sleeves. She had been raised by a granny woman in the Ohio hills, a woman who doctored a whole county before there was a doctor within 40 miles of it, and Delilah had forgotten none of it. She sent Amos to the timber with a lantern for the fever root bark, ordering the eldest boy about now with a plain authority he did not think to resist. She sent Eli to melt snow and Isaac to keep the fire high, and Ben to fetch every clean cloth in the house, and Caleb of the healed hand, who believed in her, to sit by Toby and talk to him, keep him tethered, tell him about the spring calving, anything. Don't let him drift. And she put the cook pot on, not for stew now, for medicine. She made a broth first, a true bone broth, deep and salted and rich, the kind that feeds a body that can't eat solid food, because a fevered child dies as often from want as from the fever itself. She spooned it between Toby's cracked lips a drop at a time through the long night, patient, endless, and into a second pot she built her granny's fever draught. The bark Amos brought steeped down with yarrow, and a bitter willow she'd stored, and a spoon of honey to make a child take it, and she dosed the boy through the dark hours, and bathed him in snow-cooled cloths, and sat where a mother sits, and did not sleep, and did not stop, and did not let him go. It was the longest night of Delilah Mercer's life, and she had known some long ones. There was an hour, the black hour just before the turn, when the boy went so still and so hot that she thought she had lost him, thought she was going to have to stand up off that loft floor and turn to a father and 5 brothers and tell them the littlest was gone, the same as their mother was gone. And something in her went cold and steady as pond ice. Because that was how she'd learned to carry the unbearable. You went cold and steady, and you did the next thing and the next, and you fell apart later, in private, if at all. She wet the cloth again. She got another spoon of broth past his lips. She talked to him low, called him back, told him there was a spring calving coming he'd not want to miss, and a wooden horse on the pillow beside him, lonesome for its boy. And Caleb on the other side of the bed talked too, hoarse and scared and stubborn, telling his little brother about the trout in the creek and the good climbing tree and the way the geese would come back over the pass, keeping him tethered to the world of living boys. And Silas stood in the loft doorway all that black hour with his fists clenched and his face a ruin, and could do nothing, and had to watch the woman he'd meant to send away fight for his son's life with a spoon and a pot and a granny's book, and he never forgot it, not 1 minute of it, as long as he lived. The fever broke at dawn. Delilah felt it break under her hand, felt the killing heat go out of the child's brow all at once, and the sweat come clean and cool, and the small chest ease into a true sleep, and she sat back on her heels on the loft floor and breathed. And only then, with her back to the boys, did she let 2 tears fall, and no more. And she wiped them on her apron and stood up and said, "Steady, he'll do. He'll be weak a week. Somebody get me more clean water." Silas Crane stood in the loft looking at his sleeping son, and then at the wide-plain woman he had told to take the next coach back, and something in his hard, grieving face came apart for good and did not go back together the old way. But Delilah was already thinking past her own house. If the fever draught had saved Toby, it could save Gus, and the spur-line men, and whoever else in that worn-down town was burning up while an old man rode himself to death trying to reach them all. She left Toby in Caleb's keeping, and she loaded the cook-pot and every herb off her shelf into the wagon in the gray dawn, and she drove the 9 miles down into Harland through snow to the horse's knees. And she went to Dr. Whitcomb's surgery, and she found the old man Gray, faced with exhaustion, asleep, sitting up in his own waiting room, with a dead patient in the next room he'd not had the strength to move. She woke him gentle. She told him what she had. He was too tired to be proud, which is the only reason it worked. A lesser tired man might have sent the fat bride and her granny medicine packing. But Dr. Whitcomb had watched 3 people die that week he thought he could have saved with rest and broth and a body to sit up nights, and here was a body, and she had brought a pot, and he was out of everything but grief. "Show me," he said. She showed him. And by noon the Dooley kitchen was a fever house, the cook-pot going day and night. Delilah brewing draughts and boiling broth by the gallon, while the doctor's wife and Hetty Salt and 2 of the church women who'd turned their shoulders, turning them the other way now, carried it out steaming to the sick of Harland in tin pails through the snow. Delilah organized it like a general organizes a battle, calm and quiet in the center of it. And she taught the women her granny's draught so it could go where she could not. And she sat up herself with the worst of them, the ones nobody else would nurse, old Gus among them, and she pulled him back from the edge with broth and bark and stubbornness the same as she'd pulled back the child. The days ran together into one long amber-lit labor. She did not go home to the ranch, could not, with the passes bad and the sick multiplying, and Silas sent Amos down through the snow with clean clothes and word that Toby was mending stronger every day. And Amos, seeing what his stepmother had built in the Dooley kitchen, the ordered chaos of it. The women who a month ago had scorned her now, taking her quiet orders like soldiers. The doctor deferring to her, the sick calling her name, Amos went home and did not say much, but he split a mountain of firewood that did not need splitting, which was how a 17-year-old boy says a thing he cannot say. Delilah slept 3 hours a night on a cot in the Dooley pantry and rose in the dark and started the pot again. Her hands cracked and bled at the knuckles from the lye and the cold and the endless washing, and she wrapped them in rag and kept working. She lost weight she could spare and sleep she could not, and she never once, in all of it, spoke a hard word or asked a thing for herself, and the town of Harland, watching her burn herself down to the wick to save its people, learned something about the woman it had laughed at that it would be a long time forgetting. There was a night, deep in it, when she thought she had lost the teamster, Cobb's youngest, a girl of 5, the fever gone so high the child convulsed, and Delilah worked over that little girl the whole night the way she'd worked over Toby. The same cold, steady ice inside her. The same spoon. The same low voice calling a child back from the far edge, and near dawn the fever broke, and the child slept clean, and Cobb, a big, rough man who drove mules for his living, sat down on the floor of the Dooley kitchen and put his face in his hands and wept. And Delilah put a cracked hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that broth and a spoon and a long night had not already said better. 40 sick, and by the second week of it, when the fever finally burned itself out, 38 of the 40 lived. 2 were lost, 1 an old man already dying of something else, and 1 a spur-line worker too far gone before anyone reached him. And Dr. Whitcomb told the story of those days for the rest of his life, and told it always the same way, that a rancher's wife with a cook-pot and a granny's book had done the work of 10 men and saved more of Harland than he had, and that he'd have lost 30 souls without her, and that the town ought to be ashamed it had ever laughed. The town heard him. Towns hear a doctor. And the laughing stopped. But laughing stopping does not clear a note at the bank, and December first came on hard behind the fever, and the ranch was still owed for. And Delilah, driving home worn to the bone from 3 weeks of nursing, did the arithmetic one more time by the lamp, and found that all her Thursday 2 bits and her Dooley kitchen coins, everything she'd earned and saved since October, $119.40 kept honest in her ledger, was not the half of what Silas Crane owed Elias Thorne. It was not close. She had fed the town and saved it sick, and it had not been enough, and December 1st was 3 days off. She sat with that a long while in the firelight, and then she did the last thing she had left to do, which was the thing that scared her most, because it meant standing up in front of the whole town that had laughed at her and asking. Asking did not come easy to Delilah Mercer. Giving came easy. She'd given her whole life, her cooking and her doctoring and her strong back and her sleepless nights, given and asked nothing, because asking was where a plain woman got laughed at. Asking was where the world got to say no to your face. Her whole life had been arranged so she would never have to hear the world say no to her again. But the ranch was owed for, and December 1st was 3 days off, and her $119 was not the half of it, and pride is a fine thing to keep warm at night, but it will not clear a note at a bank. So she thought it through the way she thought everything through, cold and steady, and she saw that she did not have to ask the town for herself. That she could not have done. But she could let the town do a thing for the Crane boys, and for the ranch that had fed it all fall and nursed it all through the fever, and there was a difference, and the difference was the whole of it. She would not go to the courthouse to beg. She would go, with her boys and her husband, to stand and lose the ranch with dignity, and she would trust the people she had fed to be the kind of people she had believed them to be when she fed them. She sent word quiet to 3 men, Gus and Cobb and the doctor, that the note came due Monday, and that she'd not be too proud to see help offered, having given her share of it. That was the whole of her asking. Then she left the rest to a frontier's long memory for a debt of the heart, and she banked the fire, and she slept. The note came due on a Monday, and Thorne, being the kind of man he was, had let it be known he would foreclose in the open at the courthouse before the town, so that everyone would see what became of a man who couldn't hold his ground, and everyone would learn to fear the bank. He meant it as a humiliation. It was his way. Silas, dressed in his one good coat that Monday morning gray as a man walking to his own hanging, and Delilah dressed too in her clean calico and her mended apron, and put the boys in the wagon, all 6. Toby wrapped in blankets and pale but mending, and they drove down to Harland to lose the ranch in front of everyone. The courthouse was raw, whitewashed board, and it was full. Thorne had made sure of the audience. He did not know he had made sure of the wrong thing. He stood at the front in his black frock coat with the deed papers and the sheriff beside him, dry and smiling. And he read out the debt in his smooth voice, 4 months and a note called $190 and interest against the Crane place, come due and unpaid, and he asked, as the law made him ask, whether any party present had cause or coin to stay the foreclosure, expecting silence, expecting the pleasure of the silence. And old Gus stood up in the back. Gus stood up on his bad leg, the leg that had kept him off the range and put him in Delilah's kitchen, and he said, "I'll cover $2 of it. That woman sat up 3 nights and pulled me back from dying and never asked a cent." And he limped forward and laid $2 on the courthouse rail. Then the teamster Cobb stood, $5. She fed my crew all fall for 2 bits when we were eating out of cans, and she nursed my boy through the grip. $5, and it's owed, not given. Then Dr. Whitcomb stood, 70 years old, and the room went quiet for him. "I'm an old man, and I've not got much," the doctor said, "but I've got $20, and I've never in my life spent money better. That woman saved this town. You all know she did. Thorne knows she did. He laid it down. And then it broke open, the way a thing breaks open when the first honest man says the true thing out loud. Heady salt from the mercantile, $10, and a hard nod at Delilah. The doctor's wife, whatever was in her purse, the church women who turned their shoulders, the spur-line crew, dollar by dollar, coin by coin, every man Delilah had fed hot food to when the town called her a fool. A rancher from the next spread over, who'd heard the fever story, stood and pledged the price of 2 head of cattle. Farmers, teamsters, a widow, the blacksmith, the coins and the bills coming down onto the courthouse rail in a growing heap, while Elias Thorne's smooth face went first white and then a mottled red. Because a foreclosure is a quiet cruelty, and it does not survive a town standing up in the light. Delilah stood at the side with her boys and her husband, and did not move, and did not speak, and let the town she had fed do the talking now. She had not asked for this. She had only 3 days before gone quiet to a handful of the men she'd nursed and said the ranch was owed for, and would they spread the word that she'd not be too proud to take help, having given it. She had trusted that a debt of the heart gets paid on a frontier. She had been right. They counted it on the rail. $192.60 in silver and paper, and 1 gold piece from the doctor, gathered from a town that had laughed at her 10 weeks before, enough for the note and the interest, and $2 over. The sheriff counted it twice. Thorne demanded he count it a 3rd time, and it came the same, and there was nothing in the law he could do, because the law only asked whether any party had coin to stay the foreclosure, and the party of the whole town had answered. The sheriff turned to Thorne and said, dry as Thorne had ever been, notes covered, Elias signed the release. And Thorne, before the whole of Harland, had to take up his own pen and sign away the ranch he'd waited years for. And he did it with a hand that shook, and he did not look at Delilah once, and when it was done he put on his hat and walked out of the courthouse into the cold and got into his own buggy and drove back to his bank, and the town let him go. Nobody chased him. Nobody jeered. He was simply, all at once, a small man in a big coat that no longer frightened anyone, and that was punishment enough. And Delilah, watching him go, felt no triumph, only a great tired quiet, which was how she knew her grandmother had raised her right. Outside the courthouse in the thin December sun, the town gathered around the Crane family in the snow, and it was Silas, of all people, who could not speak, Silas, the roaring hard man, standing in the street with his ranch saved, and his sons around him, and his wife beside him, and his mouth working, and nothing coming out. It was Delilah who spoke. She thanked them plain and short, no speech in her, and she said the only thing that was true, which was that there was a pot of soup on at the Dooley kitchen, because there was always a pot of soup on, and any who were hungry were welcome to it, no charge, today of all days. And the whole town of Harland walked down the street behind her and ate from her cookpot in the cold. And it was the finest supper any of them ever told of after. They drove home that night up the 9 miles with the ranch still theirs, and the boys slept in the wagon bed in a heap under the blankets. All 6, Toby's head on Amos's shoulder, Amos's arm around his brother without thinking about it, and Silas drove and Delilah sat beside him, and neither of them spoke for a long time. The mountain stood black against the stars. The cold was clean, And somewhere past the halfway mark, Silas Crane cleared his throat and said, low, not looking at her, I told you to take the next coach back. You did, she said. I was a fool. You were grieving, she said. It looks the same from the outside sometimes. He drove a while. Then he said the hardest thing he had to say, the thing that had been coming since the loft, since the sage, since the first warm supper. I don't know how to say what you've done for my boys. For me. I married you to keep a house, and I've watched you save the whole of us, and I've done nothing but doubt you the whole time you did it. His voice caught. I don't deserve it, and I don't know how to thank a person for it. Delilah was quiet a long moment. Then she reached over in the dark and put her raw, capable hand over his on the reins, the first time she had touched him, and she said, You could stop thanking me and start living like a man who intends to keep me. That'd do. And Silas Crane, widowed rancher, hard man, turned and looked at his wife in the starlight for the first time as a wife. And something long frozen in him settled and gave and warmed, the same slow way a cold kitchen warms when someone finally builds the fire. And he turned his hand over under hers and held it the rest of the way home. There is a thing that happens to a family the night after it nearly loses everything and does not. The Crane boys, riding home in the wagon bed under the blankets with the ranch still theirs, did not fully understand yet what had been done for them, or by whom. That understanding would come in over the winter, slow, the way spring comes in over the snow. But they felt the shape of it. They felt that the wide plain woman their father had told to take the coach back had, in the space of one autumn, fed them and healed them and saved their home, had done for them the things a mother does, quiet, without being thanked, without being asked, and that whatever she was to them, stepmother, stranger, the bride nobody wanted, she was not going anywhere. And neither, thank God, were they. Amos, half asleep with Toby's head heavy on his shoulder, thought about the recipe pages he had burned in the fire pit that first cold week, and shame moved in him, and under the shame, something that would in time become love. Though he was a long way yet from being able to call it that. Winter came on in earnest after that, the real Montana winter, and it was a hard one. But it was not a cold house they weathered it in. The ranch, with the note cleared, could sell its herd in the spring without ruin, and Delilah's Dooley kitchen brought in steady coin through the frozen months when the ranch brought in none, so that for the first time in 3 years the Crane place went into winter with a full larder and a stocked cellar and money set by. She put up preserves and dried her herbs and taught the boys their letters by the fire on the long, dark evenings, all 6 of them, because she found out Amos could barely read and had been ashamed of it and hiding it, and she taught him without ever once making it a shame, and by spring he read her the newspaper aloud of an evening in a voice going deep. And Silas listened to his eldest read and looked at his wife across the firelight and did not need to say the thing his face was saying. The winter evenings took on a shape as good as the days. After supper, with the pot scraped and the ladle hung and the wind walling up snow against the cabin, Delilah would set the older boys to their reading and the younger to their letters on a slate. And she would sit by the lamp with her mending or her herbs, and Silas would work at some harness or a broken hinge at the other end of the table, and the house would fill up with the small warm sounds a full and living house makes, the scratch of a slate pencil, the pop of the fire, Ben reading aloud without a single stammer, Toby snoring against her side where he'd fallen asleep half through his letters. Delilah had spent 11 years in other people's houses being useful and unremarked, sleeping in narrow beds and back rooms, and she had told herself she wanted nothing more than that. a place to be useful before she died. She had been wrong, and she knew it now, on those long, lamp-lit evenings, with a sleeping boy heavy against her ribs and a good hard man at the other end of the table, stealing looks he thought she didn't catch. She had wanted this. She had wanted this her whole life and had been too sensible to admit it, and here it was, snowed in with her and hers. She taught them more than letters. She taught Eli and Isaac to knead bread until their arms were as good as hers. She taught Ben, who had the patience for it, the names and the uses of every herb on her shelf, and he wrote them out in a careful hand in a copybook and drew each plant beside its name. And that copybook would one day be a doctor's, though none of them knew it yet. She taught Caleb to render a salve. She taught Toby, who was too little to be taught much, to sit on a stool and stir a pot and feel important, which is the most a body can teach a boy of 7 and plenty. And to Amos, who was almost a man and carried a man's shame about his unlettered state, she gave the one thing he needed most, which was time and privacy and a teacher who never once let his brothers see him struggle, so that the reading came to him not as a humiliation, but as a secret gift between the two of them, and it bound the eldest boy to her more surely than any pot of stew. The empty chair at the foot of the table, the dead woman's chair that nobody sat in, Delilah never sat in it. Not once, all that winter. But one evening near spring, Toby, mending and grown bold and full of a 7-year-old's clear sight, climbed up and sat in it himself in his mother's chair and looked around the table, half scared he'd done wrong. And nobody said anything for a moment. And then Amos, the keeper of the grief, said, "Gruff, might have liked you sitting there, runt." And that was the moment the last of the ice went out of the house, one boy in his mother's chair and his brother giving him leave, and Delilah at the stove with the ladle in her hand had to turn to the fire so they wouldn't see her face. And the found family she had gathered without meaning to came up the 9 miles all that winter and after, the way such people do on a frontier, arriving uninvited with a thing in their hands and a question in their mouths and a plain refusal to be thanked. Old Gus, mended and grateful, drove out in the worst of the cold with a haunch of elk over his shoulder and asked was there wood needed splitting, and split it whether there was or not, and stayed to supper. Hetty Salt came with a bolt of good wool she'd overordered and could not sell, which was a lie, and cut and sewed the 6 boys their first new shirts in 3 years at the Crane kitchen table, and asked Delilah, gruff, had she eaten, and made her sit while she did. Cobb the teamster hauled out a load of winter feed at cost when the Crane hay ran short, and asked did they need anything from town come Saturday, and came the next Saturday regardless of the answer. And Dr. Whitcomb, old and worn, drove out through the drifts once a fortnight to teach Delilah the doctoring her granny hadn't known, and to be taught, in his turn, the doctoring the granny had, and the two of them would sit at the plank table over the cookpot, arguing herbs and fevers like a pair of professors, while the boys did their letters. And it was, the old doctor said once, the best company he'd had since his wife passed, and he came the next fortnight regardless. The town of Harland made her something like famous in the small way a frontier town makes a person famous. They called her broth the thing that stopped the fever, and her stew the thing that saved the Crane Ranch, and mothers came out the 9 miles to have her look at a sick child. And she never turned one away, and never took more than they could give. Dr. Whitcomb, before he died 2 winters later, taught her all the doctoring he knew that her granny hadn't, and asked her to keep at it when he was gone, and she did, the wide plain bride the town had laughed at, ended her days the nearest thing Harland ever had to a second doctor, and was buried. When her time came long after, under a stone that the whole county paid for. But that was all still ahead. That first spring, when the passes opened, and the grass came green up the foothills, and the first crane calves dropped healthy in the new sun, Silas took Delilah out to the ridge above the ranch one cold evening to see it. The mended fences the boys had worked all winter, the fat spring grass. The house with real smoke off its chimney, and the sound of 6 boys' voices carrying up from the yard. He'd never been a man for words. He put his arm around his wife, and they stood in the golden light and looked at the thing they'd saved together, and after a while he said the only thing he could find, which was, "I'm glad you didn't take the coach." "So am I," said Delilah Mercer, who was Delilah Crane now, 34 years old, and home at last. And she leaned into him and breathed and settled, and they went down together to their supper. The sun was setting behind the bone-pale mountains, throwing long gold light across the yard, and stars were coming out one at a time over the range. In the warm kitchen the cook-pot steamed on the good iron stove, full of the evening stew, and around the plank table sat 6 boys who had learned again how to be a family, Amos and Eli and Isaac and Ben and Caleb and little Toby in his mother's chair, and a father who had learned again how to be one, and they were loud in the good way, the way a full table is loud. Delilah stood at the stove with the great wooden ladle in her raw, capable hand, and she filled bowl after bowl and passed them down the table, the same as she had that first cold night, only nothing was the same. Because that first night the house had been dying, and now it was alive. She had come with a duffel bag and $43 and a letter from a man who didn't want her. She was 34, and they had laughed at her on the depot bench, and she had cooked them all quiet, one warm supper at a time. Gus, who stood up first at the courthouse, and Dr. Whitcomb, who told the true thing out loud, and Hetty Salt, who put out her hard, honest hand, and a whole town that had learned to be ashamed of its own laughing. She hung the ladle back on its nail by the stove where a ladle belongs, and she sat down at last, not in the dead woman's chair, but in her own place at Silas Crane's right hand, and she breathed, and she settled, and she ate. Some brides are chosen for their beauty, and some for their money, and the whole world learns their names. And some are laughed off a depot bench with a cook-pot and a spine, and they save a ranch and a family and half a town before the world thinks to stop laughing, and those are the ones the frontier remembers longest.